All right, guys, this is the last lecture of the semester. We'll cover chapter 11 and talk a little bit about ecosystem ecology and how it interfaces with landscape ecology. A lot of the concepts that have already been introduced are repeated in this chapter, but you guys have such a handle on those at this point, it makes it somewhat of a shorter lecture, less content. So, landscapes and ecosystems are linked to the point where some use those two terms interchangeably. You'll hear folks refer to the salt marsh landscape or the longleaf pine landscape. Remember that traditionally landscapes are viewed as encompassing a broader spatial extent than that studied in ecosystem ecology. And generally we think of landscapes as being the next hierarchical scale above an ecosystem. So we think of the two in this discipline as different, although in practice you will hear the two merged at some point. As you know, an ecosystem consists of both the ecological community and the abiotic environment. It's linked via the flexes of matter and energy between two various ecosystems. Ecosystem structure generally refers to the diversity of organisms and other physical features of an ecosystem. Ecosystem function might variously refer to flexes of matter and energy and the extent to which those processes are influenced by some of the structural components, including species and functions of the ecosystem and the services provided by that ecosystem. So we can often think of ecosystem structure plus its function equaling the health and condition or status of a system. So structure and function, there's a great example, inherent example in river systems. When we think about structure and function, riverine structure is often kind of quantified by the type of stream bed, the substrates that comprise that stream bed, some of the water characteristics, quality and hydrology, the species composition found there, where the river function is often the balance of energy in that system, things like the decomposition rate of organic matter and nutrient cycling. So rivers offer us a great example to sort of reflect on structure and function and movement between terrestrial and the aquatic environment. So there are 4 ecosystem processes that are inherent in this study. All of these processes interact. The feedback relationship that we see between these processes is often the subject of study in ecosystem ecology. Water or hydraulic cycles, biogeochemical or nutrient cycling, trophic and food web dynamics, and then energy flows among those trophic levels. Obviously, the human modification of landscapes and various human land uses impact each of these processes. So recall early in the semester, we discussed how river flow regimes at various scales can influence the movement of sediment and soil across the landscape. We know at the broadest scales that movement of sediment helps to build barrier coastlines off the coast and the southeastern United States. It creates ridges and hills within the floodplain system. The river also contributes to the cycling of nutrients carried throughout that system. So rivers have been variously referred to as both the circulatory system and the skeleton, building the structure of some of our coastal systems and non-coastal riverine systems. Dams obviously have a profound effect on nutrient cycling and also sediment delivery. So are major impediments to our riverine systems. And I am sure you're all aware that nutrient loading from surrounding landscapes often finds its way into our river systems. So that link between what is happening within a watershed and the terrestrial areas, whether it be agriculture or urban, can impair water quality and obviously have a major impact on aquatic ecosystems. The book goes into a good bit of detail on nutrient cycling, and I think it is good to revisit and reflect on both the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. I added a nice little graphic here. The book did not include a graphic of the carbon cycle, but we know that cycling of carbon really happens at two different scales. What we might think of the long carbon cycle that takes between 100 and 200 million years to move carbon between rocks and soil, the ocean and the atmosphere. So that slow carbon cycle is happening on a different spatial and temporal scale than our faster carbon cycle, which is really the movement of carbon between the atmosphere and living plants and phytoplankton that we find in the ocean. So really, if they were left unperturbed, the fast and slow carbon cycles work together to maintain a relatively steady concentration of carbon in the atmosphere and land and plants in the ocean. But when anything about the amount of carbon changes in one reservoir, the effect, of course, ripples through all of the others. And the book does go into a good bit of detail on the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen, of course, is an extremely important element for plant growth, and although it is the most ubiquitous chemical in our atmosphere, with almost 78% of the atmosphere being comprised of nitrogen, its availability to plants is limited. And so the nitrogen cycle, of course, is made up of processes including fixation, ammonification, nitrification, and denitrification that happens through plants and soil microbes. The soil and the atmosphere and all are really essential for making nitrogen available for primary producers. This figure in the book is a really interesting one from a landscape ecology perspective, where we think about how so many variables can interact to define heterogeneity in the landscape. This particular study looked at topographic position and how that can influence productivity of plants within a tallgrass prairie system. So it specifically looked at the above ground net primary productivity, the ANPP, within this system. It found that topographic position often mediates the effect of other variables that are important for plant growth, fire and precipitation. Also found that grazing patterns of bison can switch from, depending on topographic position, from uplands to lowlands in response to the forage availability, which of course varies seasonally and in response to precipitation and fire. So We know that bison prefer recently burned areas and forage mostly in upland sites during the growing season when there's sufficient rainfall. Overall, fire and grazing appear to be more important for plant species diversity than topographic position. And since bison preferentially graze on burned areas, the two disturbances become linked and interact to create just a shifting disturbance mosaic that enhances heterogeneity across multiple scales. The effect of land cover on carbon availability was, I thought, an interesting study to reflect on as well. It looks at the fact that soils, of course, hold most of the carbon in the carbon cycle, accounting for more carbon than can be found in the air or vegetation. And of course, both precipitation and temperature help to regulate carbon balance, with precipitation generally increasing carbon inputs and temperature generally affecting decomposition rates and increasing carbon outputs. So this figure shows the effect of conversion from one land use type to another. It looks at grasslands, forest, agriculture, and the relative impact of moving something from one land use to another and that change that we see in carbon soil specifically. What's so interesting about carbon in the soil is that it can vary both vertically and horizontally in the soil. So we know that certain cover types promote some deeper stores of carbon in the soil, that we can actually see that horizontal change in carbon stockings. For example, more carbon would be found vertically in the soil with the shrubland habitat type than with grassland habitat type. And so this quote just emphasizes the fact that really understanding and adopting practices with how soil is used obviously has a profound effect on carbon, but also can have positive impacts on food security, agro-industries, water quality, and the environment in general. This is a sort of multifaceted, the layered cake approach of sustainability that we see throughout the rest of this chapter. So some of the concepts relating to meadow ecosystem ecology are intuitive because of how much you guys have studied meadow populations at this point. Meta ecosystems are a set of interacting ecosystems connected by the flow of energy and material and organisms. So just as we think about the flow of individuals between patches, we can actually think about the flow of other elements that are components of an ecosystem among patches as well when we think about meta ecosystems. One of the concepts related to meta ecosystems that the book discusses is the idea of spatial subsidies. And so this concept is built on the premise that ecosystems are, of course, open systems, and productivity can be subsidized by inputs originating from outside that system. The third concept the book talks about is the mobile link species, and these are species that are involved with the transfer of energy or nutrients among ecosystems. So we, for example, know that most aquatic systems rely on terrestrial subsidies for their productivity. intuitively, because water flows downhill, terrestrial inputs tend to be greater than flows in the opposite direction. The book talked about a study of some small islands, really nutrient poor, somewhat originally deserted islands found off the Gulf of California that had a unique situation and a unique relationship with the marine environment there. So the aquatic waters in this Gulf are extremely rich, exceeding primary productivity of these nearby islands, sometimes by 5 times. And such high primary productivity, of course, supports high numbers of species in this area. Fish and squid and seabirds are abundant. What we refer to as organic rack washes ashore from the marine environment onto these islands, and it's been found to be a really important source of nutrients for what would otherwise be desolate islands. So in this case, the marine inputs are subsidizing the terrestrial environment. What the study found was that smaller islands are subsidized at a greater degree than larger islands, and this is also intuitive just because of surface area to volume ratios. If they've got more shared edge with the marine environment, they are likely going to experience a larger net average subsidy rate. Smaller islands had a second really interesting factor here. They are small, and for that reason limits occupancy by predators. And these predator-free small islands are often used by nesting seabirds. So seabird rookeries have been shown to be biological pumps on these islands. The excrement of birds, the guano, feathers, eggshells, the dead fish that concentrate there bring in a lot of nutrients to those islands. So that led to those seabird rookeries showing a 14 times increase in some productivity compared to islands without seabirds. And the benefits of this were also seen to increase some elements of the island. There was a 2.8 times increase in insects and a 4 to 5 times increase in insect predators, such as spiders and lizards. But a second study I found on this, when I dug into it a little bit, showed that those nitrogen levels from the concentrated excrement of these seabirds actually had a limiting effect on plant diversity. So I've posted that other study as a reading for this week that I think you'll find interesting. A similar marine terrestrial subsidy is seen with the energy and nutrient transfer that occurs with the salmon migrations. So portions of the northern forest where we have major salmon movement can derive up to 20% of their nitrogen from marine-derived nitrogen flowing from salmon to brown bears to the forest systems there via their urine. So the concept of mobile link species, we can break into kind of 3 categories. Mobile link species, as we said, can provide essential ecosystem services. They may provide pest control or seed dispersal, pollination services. Resource linkers we can think of as those organisms that transport organic material and nutrients among ecosystems. So the examples we just talked about with the seabird and the salmon bringing essentially marine, or in origin marine-based nitrogen onto a terrestrial, into a terrestrial ecosystem is an example of a resource linker. Genetic linkers carry genetic information among ecosystems. They might bring this via seed dispersal or pollinators. And then process linkers can connect ecosystems by providing or supporting some essential process. So They might provide pest control or an essential disturbance such as grazing. In some cases, a single organism may be serving as more than one type of linker. And so, for instance, large grazers may serve as both a process linker and a genetic linker by helping to move seeds through their excrement. The example of salmon we talked about earlier could be both a resource linker bringing the nitrogen inputs, but also a process linker that creates disturbances when they create their nest upstream. Some of the concepts with source sink dynamics and meta ecosystems, I think it's also intuitive based on your knowledge of source sink dynamics with populations. The source sinks that we see here relate to the interplay of subsidies between more and less productive systems. And so, as with our discussions of source sink dynamics with populations, sometimes we have patches or systems that will switch over time and with change in their composition from a source to a sink or vice versa. This is actually a slide I have shared with you guys before when we talked about the open standards for conservation. The book goes into multifunctional uses and human uses of landscapes, or at least ascribing human-derived values to our landscapes. This intuitive sort of flow of values from our conservation scope, or what we might call our conservation targets, which are oriented around intact natural systems. And from that, we see flowing the ecosystem services that those systems provide, broken into the same four categories that the book discusses as provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural services. And then, of course, those services, ecosystem services, can relate to human well-being scope and values. And so this is a natural way for us to be able to view the human-derived value of some of our intact natural systems. And this is also a chart from the open standards that gives a little bit more thought into what we might mean when we talk about human well-being values that relate back to landscapes, and it provides just some nice definitions and a nice lexicon for that. This is a table from your book that shares a lot of that same information, looking at ecosystem functions and ascribing it values and services for humans. The book goes into some discussion of landscape function or dysfunction, and our definitions of landscape function or dysfunction are often reflect various perspectives of scientists or economists, sometimes of politicians. And of course, the concept of joint production that we just talked about is that in which landscapes provide both commodity and non-commodities. That's a theme that we see shared even among these very different perspectives of folks that might be weighing in on what is functional or dysfunctional landscape. Of course, landscape function often relates to the interactions among some of the elements of a landscape and resulting from flow of energy and matter and species. The example from your book is of mulga grass in eastern Australia and the interaction between spatial patterns and various ecological processes that give rise to positive feedback mechanisms that can help to sustain an array of landscape functions. And so you see that interplay between pattern and process and landscape function that's in balance in this system. If we add to that the perturbance of overgrazing, and especially if we couple that with drought, we see a disruption between that pattern and process. And that's, you see with the dashed line of the graph on the right. And that can lead to feedbacks that eventually erode the landscape and can result to a system state change of desertification over time. So being able to assess and monitor landscape function is obviously important. We know that once we've had a system state change, it can be really difficult to regain landscape function. So alteration of landscape structure is, of course, when we look at the patch structure of landscapes, it can reveal clues about the processes that were required to shape it. An analysis of landscape pattern often helps to provide somewhat of a diagnostic tool for evaluating the effects of the process and whether or not the processes are still intact that help to shape that landscape. Alteration of landscape connectivity, we know, can be critically important for maintaining processes such as dispersal and gene flow among populations that are going to enhance species viability and persistence over time. And then, of course, system state changes refer to a system that state change typically happens when a critical threshold or a transition takes place in which a small change near the threshold can cause a system to flip suddenly to a different state. Generally, we think of system state changes as negative, of course, or undesirable. System state changes such as movement from a grassland to desertification, or from a healthy lake to eutrophication of that lake. It would be ideal for us to be able to predict if we were getting close to a catastrophic state change, and of course implement management that would help us doing that. So there are early warning signs if we have a deep enough understanding of our systems. And the book talks about sustainability as a necessity. Sustainability and this concept of sustainable development, of course, strives to meet human development goals while sustaining the natural systems that provide natural resources and ecosystem services upon which our economy and society often depend. That concept of landscape multifunctionality is a huge focus of conservation work, of my daily work. It's typically applied to management of human-dominated landscapes, such as like agricultural landscapes, where we might think about some set-asides for natural systems. We also see some people striving to do this with residential development. So the array of pictures I have here are of a development called Spring Island in Beaufort, South Carolina, that strives to have a sustainable development model where people have a lot of sort of guidelines and restrictions around how they build, what is removed from the natural system, what kind of plants they put in their yard, the fact that they don't have paved roads on this island, all play to that concept of sustainable development.